The lake was not on any modern map. Not even the locals spoke its name, save in half-jokes and superstitions. They called it Waverly Mere, though the hamlet of Waverly had long since vanished, drowned or erased, no one could say which. All that remained was a stretch of black, glassy water that never froze and never rippled, no matter how hard the wind pushed. The trees along the bank bent toward it as if listening, and the birds never flew over it. When Maeve Harlow returned to the estate after 20 years, the lake was the first thing she noticed. It was still breathing. Her family's house, Waverly Hold, crouched on the hill above the mere like a spider on a silken web, its turrets hollowed by time, its windows blind with dust. The wrought iron gates squealed open at her touch as if they remembered her fingers. The solicitor had warned her, the estate is structurally sound, but odd. Certain doors refuse to stay closed. The cellar smells of smoke despite no source of fire. And none of the clocks will stay wound. She hadn't cared. She needed somewhere to disappear. Somewhere no one would ask about the trial. About what she'd done. About who she had left behind. The lake watched her as she unpacked. It didn't sparkle. It didn't shift. But it watched. And that night, as she lay in the room that had once belonged to her grandmother, she heard it. Chimes. Under water. Slow and hollow. She pressed her ear to the floorboards. And for just a second, she swore the house was gently swaying, as though resting on some ancient current. In the morning, she found footprints on the dock. Bare. Wet. One set led toward the lake. And none returned. She walked the perimeter of the shore, noticing how the reeds grew in unnatural circles. They pulsed faintly, like breathing lungs just beneath the surface. The deeper she went into the fog, the more the trees began to warp, twisting inward, their trunks forming natural arches over the path like cathedral vaults. At the end of the path was something she didn't expect. A lantern. It sat atop a post of driftwood, bound with rusted chain, its glass smoky and warped. Inside it, a single white flame flickered, not gold, not orange, but bone-white, like the fire of a distant star. And beneath it, nailed to the post, one debt paid, for remain. Maeve turned, and found a second lantern now lit behind her, though she hadn't seen it before. Its flame was blue. She ran. The path behind her had changed. She reached the house in half the time, but her feet were wet, soaked up to the ankles, though she had never stepped off the bank. Mud tracked behind her like shadowed footprints. The lights in the house blinked as she entered. And somewhere in the distance, a third chime rang underwater. She opened the old family ledger in the study that night, desperate to find some mention of the lake or the lanterns. Page after page of her ancestors' lives filled the dusty book, births, deaths, debts, crimes all recorded with exquisite penmanship. But one entry stopped her breath. It was dated 1843. It read, "A pact sealed in flood and flame. We borrowed years we could not afford. The mere keeps account. And when the fifth light burns, the hold will fall." Maeve didn't sleep. Every room in the house had started to shift. Books moved when she looked away. Mirrors held their reflections a moment too long. And the grandfather clock in the hallway began ticking backward. At dawn, she stood again by the lake. The fog was gone. And the water, still as glass, reflected the impossible. A chapel beneath the surface, fully intact, its steeple rising like a tooth, its stained glass windows glowing from within. And there, just outside the half-open chapel doors, stood 4 lanterns in a circle. 3 already lit. The 4th sat dark. And in its base, floating inside the flame of the 3rd, was a name. Maeve Harlow. Maeve stood at the edge of the dock, staring into water so still it seemed painted. Below the surface, the chapel waited, sunken yet untouched by time or pressure. Its black spire pierced upward like the rib of some vast, submerged creature. Light flickered behind stained glass windows in hues no sun had ever produced. And the 4th lantern, unlit, stood outside the chapel's arched doors. Her name drifted inside the 3rd's blue flame, shimmering like smoke. Maeve Harlow. A sudden gust moved over the lake, though no wind touched her skin. The water rippled only inward, toward the center, toward the chapel, as if drawing breath. Something was waking. Something remembered. Back at the house, the garden was no longer a garden. The vines had overgrown the statues, curling into shapes that looked suspiciously like hands. The sundial spun slowly without light. The old gazebo had collapsed, revealing a stone well that hadn't been visible the day before. And all along the ground were tiny, pale white wings. Moth wings. No bodies. Just wings. Hundreds of them. Maeve returned to the family ledger. More pages had appeared. She was certain they weren't there yesterday. The ink was fresh, the handwriting angular, tight. 1844. The water took Ruth Harlow on the eve of her marriage. The debt was hers by blood. She did not go willingly. The flame burned blue for 7 nights. 1866. Elias Harlow begged the chapel for time. The Mere obliged. The price was not his own. 1921. When we buried Constance in dry soil, the bell rang twice beneath the lake. The 4th lantern stirred. But no name appeared. The final line on the last page sent a tremor through her spine. 2025. Maeve returns. The pact stirs. The fire remembers. The 5th is nearly lit. She touched the ink. It was still wet. That night, the dream came. She stood inside the underwater chapel. The pews were carved from bone. Animal, human, hard to tell. On each sat faceless figures, their heads bowed in prayer to something behind the altar. A choir of moths fluttered overhead, silent. And in the center, the lantern keeper waited. He wore no robes. Just a shawl of black reeds and a mask made of stitched leather with too many eye-holes. When he spoke, it was in a voice like distant bells through thick fog. One by one, your kin stole time. I didn't, Maeve said. You inherited the flame. It doesn't care whether you lit it. He reached toward her chest. And as his fingers touched her sternum, she felt her breath stop. The 4th fire waits. The bone remembers. The lake forgives nothing. She awoke screaming. And the house smelled of smoke. In the hallway, the clock had shattered. Its hands lay on the floor, not made of brass but vertebrae, polished to a gleam. They ticked by themselves, twitching slightly when she got too close. In the mirror at the end of the corridor, her reflection didn't move with her. It just stood there, staring, waiting. Maeve left the house at dawn. The mist rolled in heavy, swallowing the path, but she walked it anyway. The reeds around the mere swayed without breeze, brushing her ankles like hands searching for purchase. She reached the edge and found something new. A boat. Small. Old. Covered in moss. Inside it, a single oar. And a lantern already lit. Its flame was red. No note. No name. Just a long crack in the seat that seemed too deliberate to be wrought. Like a mouth. Like it had spoken before and might again. Maeve hesitated. But the fire was calling her name in silence. She boarded the boat and pushed off from the shore. The water accepted her without a sound. The lake was deeper than it looked. Beneath her, shadows swam without shape, long tendrils of something not quite animal, not quite natural. She passed between the submerged trees of an ancient grove, leafless and dead, but still reaching for the sky. And then the chapel rose beneath her, fully visible through the water like a vision through glass. She looked down. The front doors opened. The boat stopped by itself above the chapel's roof. A bell tolled once. Not above. Not beside. From inside her. She dove. Not because she wanted to, but because there was no surface anymore. The water was no longer wet. No longer cold. It felt like memory, pulling at her lungs, her veins, her thoughts. She swam downward. Through the chapel doors. Into the nave. The congregation was still seated, their heads lifted, and every face was her own. At the altar stood the lantern keeper. This time, he removed his mask. And beneath it was her father's face, decayed and ageless, lips cracked open in a crooked smile. We never paid what we owed. You're dead. So is debt. That doesn't stop it. He stepped aside. Behind the altar was a fifth lantern. Still dark. It had no flame, but it throbbed like a heart. Maeve reached out. The flame burst into life. Not red, not blue, not bone-white, but black, colorless and whole. And inside it, she saw the chapel collapse. She saw the house burn in reverse. She saw herself born in a cradle made of ash. And then, the congregation began to sing, but not in words, in moths. Thousands of them, pouring from their mouths, forming a vortex of wings that swallowed the air. She screamed underwater, and awoke in her bed, holding the fifth lantern in her hands, its black flame still burning, and beneath it, one final message. Debt paid. The lantern still burned black. Maeve placed it on the windowsill of the old study, far from her bed, but the light still touched her skin in the dark. It wasn't bright, rather, it drank the darkness, curling it into slow-moving shadows that whispered across the floorboards like smoke. She hadn't slept in 2 days. The flames didn't let her. She had tried to leave, packed her bags, crossed the long gravel road that led through the woods. But the car wouldn't start. The key broke in the ignition, and when she turned around, the house was closer, not in a way that made sense. It wasn't following her, but it was nearer, its windows now visible through the trees where they hadn't been before. And the lake. The lake was watching from all directions. That morning, she followed the cracks in the floor. Hairline fractures that had begun to appear under the rug, the furniture, even her bed frame. They weren't signs of decay, they were intentional, carving a spiraled pattern that led toward the garden. Or what was once a garden. Now, the soil steamed. The flower beds had rotted into swamp-like furrows of black mulch and twisted stems. Statues of angels wept moss. The sundial stood cracked in half, its gnomon replaced with a rib bone, sharpened and carved with runes that glowed faintly in the fog. And at the very center, where a marble fountain had once stood, was something new. A pit. Shallow at first glance, but it breathed. The earth around it pulsed, and faint whispers came from inside, names being spoken just beneath the threshold of understanding. She leaned in, and heard her own voice whisper, Maeve. Maeve Harlow. She remembers. She is the fifth. She is the last. Then silence, and a faint metallic sound, like something being slowly wound. Inside the pit, bones bloomed like roots. Delicate, white, child-sized phalanges curled around a rusted lantern post, unlit. No flame. No inscription. Just a mirror fragment tucked inside. Maeve pulled it free, and in its reflection she saw not herself, but her mother, kneeling in that same pit, burying something in the dark. Back in the house, Maeve tore through the attic. Dust thick enough to choke. Portraits covered in black veils. A single rocking horse rocking gently without wind. Behind a shelf of crumbling ledgers, she found a trunk. Inside, her mother's wedding dress, still stained with lake water. A bundle of letters tied in silk. And at the very bottom, a jawbone, small, human, carved into its back. Ruth Harlow, returned but not received. Maeve dropped it, and from downstairs, the bell rang. Not once, not twice, but 5 times. The black lantern on the windowsill began to flicker. Not randomly. It blinked, like a Morse code message from something ancient and forgotten. The shadows on the wall moved with purpose. One detached from the others, and took shape. It was a girl. 8, maybe 9. Hair soaked. Skin gray as ash. Her eyes were hollow, yet Maeve felt a pain in her chest as if she knew her, deeply, terribly, but couldn't place why. The girl opened her mouth, and a moth crawled out, wingless and blind. Then the girl said, "You took her name." Maeve shook her head. "I don't know what you mean." The girl pointed to the jawbone. "She was Ruth. You are Ruth. But your mother changed it. To break the chain. To steal the years." Maeve whispered, That's not my name. The girl stepped closer. Names rot in this house. But they don't disappear. They wait. Yours is due. She raised a hand. And suddenly, the floor cracked open beneath Maeve's feet. She fell. Not through wood. Not through soil. But through memory. She saw her mother, 20 years younger, holding a swaddled child beside the lake. She whispered to the water, begging something unseen. Take another. Leave her be. Please, this time, I'll bury the name. The lake answered not in voice, but in silence. A silence that throbbed, and accepted. Then Maeve saw herself, age 6, walking into the cellar where the walls hummed with wetness. Her father shouted. Her mother wept. And behind them, the 5th lantern lit for the first time, then immediately went out. She saw a girl with her face, drowning in a reflection, and another emerging from it. Maeve woke in the pit. The lantern there now burned blue. It bore no name, but her reflection inside was flickering, fading in and out like a dying star. And above her, the trees began to wither inward. The air turned solid. She climbed out and ran. The house seemed smaller now, but deeper. Rooms stacked on rooms. Hallways that looped in impossible curves. The doors whispered as she passed. Back in the study, the black flame on the sill was gone. In its place stood a note in the lantern keeper's hand. The debt is not extinguished. It is inherited. And beneath that, return to the chapel. Alone. She turned to the mirror. And this time, it didn't reflect her at all. It showed the chapel underwater, doors wide open, and all 5 lanterns burning. She stepped toward the glass. And the mirror breathed out. Maeve stepped into the mirror. But it wasn't glass. It was water, cold, dark, and sentient. It slid around her like memory, clinging to her bones, burrowing into her breath. For a moment she floated in total silence, suspended between time and reflection. Then she landed. Not with a splash. With a pulse. The chapel was no longer under the lake. It stood in the middle of a salt plain, flat, endless, dry as bone, but the air reeked of brine. The sky above was a lidless eye of gray. Around the chapel, 5 figures, cloaked, each holding a lantern of a different hue, red, blue, white, black, and a dull gray. The gray flame flickered weakly. It was hers. And it was dying. The lantern keeper stood atop the steeple, unmoving, arms extended in supplication. His mask had changed. It now bore a mirror across the face. It reflected not her, but a girl with no mouth and hollow eyes. Maeve stepped forward. The congregation parted like mist. She entered the chapel. Inside, the pews were empty. The walls bled water, weeping down through the stones. On the altar lay 5 items. A locket. A moth wing pinned in amber. A child's tooth. A clock hand made of ivory. A name carved into bark, Maeve Ruth Harlow. When she touched the bark, it crumbled to ash. The lantern keeper spoke, but not aloud. All light dies. But debt roots. It breeds. I never asked for this, Maeve said. No one does. That is why it matters. The keeper turned toward her, mask gleaming. 5 generations borrowed time. Now the balance is due. Take me, then. It won't be enough. The chapel shook. Dust fell like rain. And from beneath the floor, roots began to rise, knotted, bone-white, engraved with names. Harlow after Harlow. Some she recognized. Most she didn't. They twisted toward her. And one by one, entered her skin. She screamed. But the roots did not pierce flesh. They pierced memory. She saw her grandmother as a young woman, making a pact in the reeds. She saw her mother drowning the real Maeve in the lake, and pulling a reflected version free. She saw herself, not born, but chosen, a vessel molded from grief and bargains. Her name was not hers. Her face belonged to someone else. She was the 5th fire, Not a person but a placeholder. A stand-in for the dead. She collapsed. And when she awoke, the chapel was burning. But not with flame. With time. Everything reversed. The pews grew younger. The stones uncracked. The moths reassembled and flew backward through the air. The lanterns pulsed in rhythm. And a voice spoke from inside her bones. You must take the light into yourself. The gray flame appeared before her. It hovered, pulsing weakly. It had no color now, only shape. She reached forward and swallowed it. Pain seared through her veins. Her skin split, not with blood, but with names. They poured from her, Ruth, Elias, Constance, Thomas, Marjorie, Theodora, Nathaniel, until only one name remained. Hers. The lantern keeper descended. His mask fell, and behind it was her. Not a reflection, not a version, but her, grown old, worn hollow, eyes milky with things no one should remember. I kept it burning, so you could forget. Forget what? That you were never supposed to exist. The old Maeve reached out and handed her the black lantern. The flame inside flickered one last time. Extinguish it, or take my place. Maeve turned to the congregation. They stared with empty eyes, waiting, and in that moment, she understood. This was the final inheritance. The flame wasn't the curse. It was memory, raw and unfiltered, eternal and inescapable. To put it out was to let the truth die. To keep it was to bear every sin, every theft, every name buried in the water. She lit the lantern, held it high, and walked into the sea of roots. The chapel vanished. The salt plain cracked, and the mirror shattered. 1 year later, Waverly House was sold to a London antiquarian. The buyer's daughter moved in. Bright, clever, a bit lonely. She took long walks by the lake. One evening, she found an old lantern beneath the dock. Its glass was clouded, its flame barely visible. She lifted it, and inside, it flickered suddenly blue, then red, then black. She smiled. Pretty. Behind her, the reeds stirred, and in the water's reflection, someone else smiled back.